Stop me if you've heard this before. Ashes of Creation is a highly ambitious MMO. Not only do they have an incredible amount of systems planned, many of them they want to be the best ever seen in an MMO. The best weather and seasons, the best character creator, one of the biggest maps, and probably the most systems and complexity at the launch of any MMO in history. In addition to that, they want to pull off something very few have pulled off before, and that is extremely large-scale open-world PvP battles that actually run well and do not become a slideshow. Now, some people think no MMOs have ever achieved this, but that is just not true. Throne and Liberty recently had massive siege battles with over 3,000 players. EVE Online has had huge 3,000 plus player battles for a long time, but that honestly doesn't really count because they use time dilation, which in essence means every time you use an ability you have to wait a shit ton of time before it actually activates. Then you have PlanetSide 2, which has had over 1,000 player battles in an FPS setting, which is very impressive to me. So for those that claim it isn't possible, you're wrong. That doesn't mean Intrepid will pull this off, but it is possible. Technically, Ashes is going for 500 versus 500 in their castle and node sieges. However, with these sieges being open world, there's nothing stopping them from becoming much larger than 500 versus 500. The only limitations for players that are not registered is they cannot capture the castle, and if they die, they will not respawn in the castle siege area. But with 5 guild castles and 10,000 concurrent players per server, that means roughly 2,000 of those 10,000 players will be within the zone of influence of each castle. So the siege numbers could easily push higher than 500 versus 500, but probably not as big as like 1,500 versus 1,000, which is roughly what the Throne and Liberty sieges were, because Throne and Liberty just has one castle for the entire server. Either way, these numbers are huge, and most MMOs outside of Throne and Liberty and a few others to this point have greatly struggled with this many players on a screen. Next, I want to talk about what Intrepid has shown so far and what they have talked about in terms of performance in large-scale PvP. But first, it is, indeed, that time. Snorkels are today's video sponsor. Have you ever wanted to go just a little underwater but not a lot underwater? If you do, you need a motherfucking snorkel. Shove this tube up your mouth, put some weird-ass flippers and goggles on, and get your ass in the water, noob. Snorkels are great. Thanks, Snorkels. Intrepid has shown a lot of promise in their ability to host a lot of players on screen. During Alpha 1 testing, there were a lot of castle sieges that were tested, and while the amount of players on screen wasn't as large as what they intend them to be eventually, the performance with well over 100 people on screen was extremely good, and that was a very early version of the game. After Alpha 1, they had some showcases in September 21 and December 21 that showed off some new rendering techniques that were intended to optimize graphical performance. Long story short, they basically said that they reduced the number of draw calls per player down to just 1 when it was 12 in Alpha 1. This is because each armor piece was its own draw call. Now each time a player changes an armor piece, a new player mesh is made into a single draw call. They also do this for the player weapons and their mount to create just one draw call for all of it per player. Using this new rendering technique, they showed off 1,300 simulated players in a castle siege, and the frame rate on a 1080 was 30 frames per second. This rendering technique obviously helps graphical performance, but is it actually new or revolutionary? Because so often I see the word revolutionary thrown out about Ashes when they talk about some of their technical details, when the reality is they are not actually the first MMO to do things like this. And based off some digging I did, I don't think this technique is 100% unique to Ashes of Creation. I think a fair amount of other developers have done this. But that does not mean them thinking about performance constantly and using every single trick they possibly can to ensure they hit this lofty goal isn't a good thing. It is of course a good thing, because when you look at what will be going on with an Ashes of Creation server in comparison to say a Throne and Liberty server, Ashes servers are going to have a lot more going on. Even in the castle siege itself, there will be a lot more, especially when you consider the combat system. One thing I think helps Throne and Liberty is they don't have a very complex combat system, whereas Ashes does. There are a lot more skills in Ashes, and they are not all locked behind long cooldowns like in Throne and Liberty. There's a lot more build customization in Ashes as well, and there is projectile and player collision in Ashes, which adds even more to the complexity. It is because of this complexity not only in the combat system, but also with the insane amount of systems in Ashes that performance will be trickier than it is in much simpler games like Throne and Liberty. But I think it's still very possible to pull it all off. We did hear a lot about performance in the Node Wars from the PI testers who were able to talk about their experience. There were 6 Node War spot tests, but the first few were very rough, but by the end, the performance was much better. But still, in the showcase, we still see noticeable rubber banding, and the number of players is still pretty small. But I have no doubt they will continue to improve, as they always have. And this month is a tech demo where they hinted at talking about performance, maybe a little more, and how they intend to get really high performance in this game. Of all the promises of Ashes of Creation, which are many, massive sieges that are highly performant is one of the bigger ones, and I think it is important to remember that while we have seen some really nice showcases the last few years, to me, Intrepid still has a lot to prove. But I think they're on the right track, and I think they can get there. I think one ace in the sleeve of Intrepid is the talent level is for sure increasing. They get a massive amount of applicants for every new position, and they are highly selective on who they will hire. This means they are getting very high quality people, and that is not something every developer can say. So while we'll always be objective and never give Intrepid credit for anything until we actually see them succeed with some of these lofty goals, I'm still highly optimistic that they can pull it off. Tonight I have a special guest on Ryvelations Alpha Soul, who is a PI tester who participated in the Node Wars and is an early Ashes of Creation content creator. A little bit later tonight, 7 p.m. Central Time. I'll see you there, and I'll see you guys in the next video.